You know, in the United States of America, we wouldn't have virtually any music if it weren't for the black people. Virtually, I think all of our music, whether it's country, western, bluegrass, the blues, rock and roll, you name it, it all started and came from black America. So when you listen to the music of your choice, remember, chances are you wouldn't hear that music if it weren't for black people long ago.
White men, black men on the beam, a real solid all-American team. He had tall men, small men, fat and lean.
But stop still and listen to me. God walked down to the branded sea.
Yeah, he the total swing. Just about ready to do that thing. I don't want no tears, I don't want no lies. Above all, I don't want no alibis.
With me one time, y'all. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody just clap your hands, huh? Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody just clap your hands, huh?
You don't stop. Rock it out, baby. Rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat. Now what you hear is not a test. I'm rapping to the beat.
Don't give me all that jive about things you wrote before highs alive. But this ain't 1823, ain't even 1970.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Dreams about the seats make your body sway. Socialize. Get down. Let your soul lead the way. Shake it down. Go, ladies. Thinking of a master plan. Death with the record. Death with the record. Thinking of a master plan. Death with the record. Death with the record. Wu-Tang, killer bees on the swarm. Rain on your college as disco dorm. Slippery when wet, and don't you ever forget you couldn't get a flick.
In the birth of hip-hop, the question was whether or not Latinos participated in the birth of hip-hop. Did Latinos, are they the co-creators of hip-hop? The answer is no, they are not. Hip-hop is an African cultural art form. Rap music came from the songs that our ancestors sang on the plantation as they worked. Rap music came from the rhythms and the poems that our ancestors sang on the plantation. Rap music grew out of the blues, which grew out of the poetry of enslaved Africans on the plantation. So if you were not an enslaved African, and if you don't consider yourself to be a black African, how can you be co-creator of rap when rap descended from the plantation poetry and plantation rhythm of the American African slave experience? No disrespect to nobody. No disrespect to nobody. No disrespect to nobody. Now, my African Cubans, my African Puerto Ricans, my African Dominicans, they can say hip hop came from me because they're coming from an African perspective. The African Cubans, the African Ricans, the African Dominicans can say, I'm the father of hip hop because they're speaking as a member of the African family, just like Dr. Umar, who is not a rapper. And I was not there when hip hop had its birth, but because I am an African.
Peace. It's your boy, Grandmaster Kaz. Now, I've recently heard some controversy going around on Twitter about a comment I made in a Vlad interview a few years back. Well, let me clear some shit up for you right about now. Some of the first Latinos in hip-hop were down with me. Disco Wiz, Charlie Chase, Joe Conzo, the man who took hip-hop's baby pictures, Prince Whipper Whip, okay? All Latinos, all part of my crew, okay? So there's no way that I could talk about there not being a Latino presence in the culture of hip-hop. Now, I've stuck my foot in my mouth a couple of times on Vlad interviews, and they probably caught a off, you know what I mean, comment or something like that. But let me clear that up. For all my brothers, my Latino brothers and sisters in hip-hop, I've been an advocate since day one. So knock the bullshit off. Peace.
Salsa music is deeply rooted in African rhythms that were brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. Yoruba, Congo, and Bantu rhythms were fused with Spanish and indigenous music in Cuba to create what is now known as salsa music. African drumming styles like the clave and the bongo became integral components of salsa's distinct sound with their syncopated beats and the use of polyrhythms. Salsa music emerged out of the social clubs and dance halls of Havana in the 1940s and spread throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, fusing with jazz, rock, and pop influences as it traveled. It was pioneered by musicians such as Tito Puente, Frank Grillo, Hector Lavoe, Johnny Pacheco, Ray Barreto, and Celia Cruz. Today, salsa continues to evolve and grow as a global dance and music phenomenon, connecting people across cultures and continents.
Hey, what's going on, TikTok? Hey, another fun fact, man. Marachi.
I know you did not just come onto Vicente Fernandez's Wi-Fi trying to say that Black influence is in mariachi music.
But there is, though. There is absolutely Black/African influence in mariachi music and in many, many aspects of Mexican culture, similar to almost every single Latin American country, because slavery. I only have 3 minutes, so I'm gonna try to make this quick. But before we talk about the Black influence in mariachi music, we have to talk about Black erasure in Mexican history and in Mexican culture. This guy, Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, was one of the first people to incorporate more Black history in Mexican literature. He wrote this book right here, La Población Negra de Mexico, in 1947, and actually it was shelved because nobody was buying it because nobody wanted to learn about Black history in Mexico. And then it returned to the shelves in like the 1970s or the 1980s, something like that. Like I said, I come with receipts. So I found this really great research paper that discusses the enslaved Africans in Mexico, and over 200,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Mexico. Fun fact. Me and this creator have been going back and forth in her comments about where the concentration of Black people were in Mexico. And granted, there is a higher population of Black peoples in the coast and in cities like Veracruz and Oaxaca, but enslaved Africans were brought to all parts of Mexico. Pause to read. Pause to continue reading. So while we can say that there is going to be a more identifiable African influence in Veracruz and Oaxaca, we can't rightly argue that there's going to be no other African influence in other parts of Mexico when there were Africans in all parts of Mexico. And where there are Africans, there will be African influence. Largely, the African influence in other parts of Mexico are not identifiable because many enslaved Africans intermarried with indigenous women to gain their freedom. Sound familiar? Mejorar la raza in the Caribbean? So let's pause to read this. We can't talk about Black erasure without talking about mestizaje. Specifically in Mexico, there was a large push for a Mexican identity being largely European and indigenous, which obviously erases Black people. I found this really great article by Mari Carmen Lara Villanueva that discusses this in the context of anti-Black racism in Mexico. Let's read up on this part of the article that specifically goes into this idealized mixed race identity. This idea of mestizaje has pervaded all aspects of Mexican culture and life, including in the education system, which is why even if you're from Mexico, you're not going to learn about the African influence in your culture unless you research it. Sorry to say. I only have about 15 more seconds. I'm going to start with this guy in part 2, Rolando Antonio Perez Fernandez, who is an ethnomusicologist and a researcher who has identified the African influence in mariachi music.